If you've spent any amount of time online, then you've almost certainly come across the term alpha. Once just the first letter of the Greek alphabet, alpha has come to mean today someone who's a leader, hyper-confident, and supposedly crushing life 24/7. And whether used ironically or not, it suggests, amongst your peers, or possibly just in your own mind, that you are the unquestioned top dog. And that term, top dog, is particularly important, because setting all that human alpha stuff aside, when you rewind to the original imagery of an alpha, there's always one animal that comes to mind. The wolf. Intimidating, teeth bared, covered in battle scars, and ruling from a thunderous mountaintop. So, the legitimacy of alpha culture in humans aside, surely this animal, immortalized as being the blueprint for power, dominance, and leadership, is an honest depiction of the alpha trope we know today. Well, hold on to your woolen socks, because the original alpha might not even be as alpha as you thought. Before discussing wolf hierarchies, it's important to note that hierarchy in the animal kingdom is obviously a very real thing, existing across species of all sizes and taking many different forms. Within the world of insects, for example, species of ant, bee, and termite showcase some of the most extreme versions of hierarchy, with numerous species from each of these groups being referred to as eusocial, its members living in colonies. What sets eusocial insects aside is that only one individual is reproductive, usually a queen. The rest of the colony? They're just sterile workers with various roles, their lives spent foraging, protecting, preserving the colony, and eventually giving rise to a new queen when the time comes. Leaving behind hierarchies where individuals are born into determined roles, we find the clownfish. Made famous by the Pixar movie Finding Nemo, these reef dwellers live in strict size-based colonies. In these colonies, the largest individual becomes the breeding female, and the second largest individual becomes the breeding male. Similarly to insects, all the other members of the colony are just non-breeding subordinates. So, when the breeding female eventually dies, the largest male, formerly the breeding male, changes sex and becomes the new female. In turn, the next largest male, formerly a subordinate, becomes the new breeding male. This reproductive strategy is called protrandrous sequential hermaphroditism. Put in simple terms, it means that their sex isn't fixed, and in the case of the clownfish, that they are born male, but can become a female under the right circumstances. But once they make the switch, there's no going back. So backing this up 2 seconds, if you follow the logic in the film Finding Nemo, where Nemo's father and Nemo are the only 2 remaining members of their colony, Nemo's father would have essentially become his mother, but also his lover, which adds a whole new dimension to the term motherfucker. In mammals, hierarchy is more nuanced and complex, and this is because, in many social mammalian species, factors like age, strength, and social bonds play important roles in determining one's position on the social ladder. Gorillas, for instance, live in social groups known as troops, which are usually made up of one dominant adult male, often referred to as a silverback, several adult females, and their offspring. The dominant male holds his position through a combination of strength and social intelligence. He leads the group's daily migrations, decides when and where to feed, and steps in to break up conflicts. He's also the group's primary defender against predators or rival males. This role, however, is not fixed. Individuals, often younger males, may challenge the lead silverback, especially if they sense weakness from him due to an injury or just old age. If the challenger wins, sometimes just through ground slapping, hooting, and chest beating rather than an actual fight, he can take over as leader. But then, he has to secure that role by forming strong social ties with the females. All this to say, nature holds various kinds of hierarchies. Some are determined at birth, some are due to genetics, some are determined by hormones, and some are just determined by sheer size. But the point I'm trying to make is that being at the top isn't always about sheer violence or domination. Which brings us to the wolf, an animal whose social order has consistently been misunderstood in the scientific community and glorified for decades. If you ask anyone what they know about wolves, the most likely answer you'll get is that they're led by an alpha. But in actual fact, very few people know where this term even comes from. The term alpha obviously predates its usage in animal behavior. As mentioned before, it's the first letter of the Greek alphabet. But when it comes to wolves, the concept can be traced back to one man, Rudolf Schenkel, a Swiss zoologist. Although his name isn't widely known, Schenkel played a major role in shaping early ethology, the scientific study of animal behavior, particularly in relation to wolf social structures. And it could easily be argued that his most pivotal publication is from 1947, titled Expression Studies on Wolves, Captivity Observations. The study's findings were important in their own right, but what truly sealed the paper's place in history was that it marked the first reference of an alpha when describing a wolf. For more context, the study was based on observations of wolves kept at the Basel Zoo in Switzerland between 1934 and 1942, a colossal feat. And this was especially so, given that at the time, information on wolf behavior was extremely sparse, with Schenkel even noting in his paper that thorough studies of the sociology of the wolf outside of captivity do not exist. However, the animal novels of Thompson Seton, Jack London, Aslakson et al. Provide an approximate picture. Just for clarity, by the way, those are the names of authors who wrote stories that involve wild wolves. They're not scientists, they're not writing studies on them, they're just novels. That's what Schenkel had to work with at the time when it came to wild wolves. Anyway, during his 8 years of observations, he'd end up observing a total of 10 wolves, all of which were unrelated. To make things worse, the makeshift packs were all kept within an enclosure measuring 20 by 10 meters, a space comparable to a tennis court. In such tight quarters, tensions rose, fights inevitably broke out, and dominance hierarchies quickly followed, with some wolves subsequently controlling access to food, the best resting spots, and, well, mates. What Schenkel then did is that he described each level of this hierarchy using Greek letter designations, with on top the alphas, followed by the betas, the gammas, and so on. But, and this is important, Schenkel repeatedly emphasized within this study that what he was observing were the behaviors of captive wolves, which he never claimed perfectly reflected the behavior of wolves in the wild. To understand how misleading such an assertion would have been, imagine locking the cast of Friends in a cage for several years, poking them with a stick occasionally, and then writing a book about human social structures based on what they did. Well, to anyone reading such a study, it would most likely sound as if it had been written by aliens who were pretending to be human. And the same goes for the wolves. Unfortunately, Schenkel's cautions were largely overlooked, and without the benefit of hindsight, scientists, with one man in particular, missed the memo to take his study with a grain of salt. Enter Dave Mech, an American wildlife biologist and now one of the world's foremost experts on wolves. In 1970, Mech published The Wolf: Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species. This study was the culmination of long-term field research on the Isle Royale, a remote island in Lake Superior, Michigan, conducted from 1958 to 1962. In his publication, Mech had written of the hierarchical dynamics he noted on Isle Royale, but his observations were clearly seen through Schenkel-tinted glasses, leading Mech to continue using the term alpha to describe the leaders of a wolf pack, just as Schenkel had. You might now be thinking to yourself, who cares if Mech was inspired by Schenkel? His study was on wild wolves. So, surely what he observed was true wild wolf behavior? Well, yes and no. Although the study technically took place in the wild, Isle Royale was never the best representation of the typical ecology of wolves. And this is largely because the island is small and isolated, only about 535 square kilometers, which meant the wolves living there couldn't disperse, migrate, or form new packs in way wolves normally do across large landscapes. In most wolf populations, prey availability is the primary limiting factor, accounting for 64% of the variation in wolf density. The wolves of Isle Royale reach unusually high densities thanks to abundant prey and regardless of a limited area to inhabit. In fact, their population density has even been cited as an upper limit within North America, at roughly 92 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers, more than double what some studies thought was once possible. What this essentially means is that the environment in Isle Royale meant that there were too many wolves with too little space. In that respect, the setup was not entirely unlike Schenkel's zoo enclosure: abundant food, but insufficient room for natural dispersal and pack formation. So it's not surprising that Mech's observations mirrored Schenkel's. So while the data collected on Isle Royale was invaluable in its own right, its ecological constraints and genetic bottleneck did mean that the wolf behavior observed there was far from a universal template for healthy, free-ranging wolf populations. And so, with Mech's findings becoming published and his book becoming widespread, the alpha concept, once fairly unknown, not only persisted, but would become mainstream. In the decades following the publication of his book, Mech would start a new chapter in his research, and one that would help overturn the very ideas he helped popularize. Starting in 1986, he spent 25 consecutive summers studying wolves on Ellesmere Island, a 196,000 square kilometer vast expanse in the Canadian high Arctic. And this was as wild as it gets. No real roads, no major settlements, just tundra stretching endlessly, with wolves, muskox, hares, and a bunch of other animals built for freezing conditions. And unlike the constrained setting of Isle Royale, an island that is, for perspective, 366 times smaller than the vast Ellesmere Island, the wolves of Ellesmere were free to disperse, choose mates, raise pups, and interact with little human interference. And what Mech found was that hierarchy here was strikingly different from the old dominance model, because these weren't gangs of unrelated individuals battling for status. They were families. The so-called alpha male and alpha female, they were just the parents. Their authority didn't come from fighting their way to the top. It came from being, well, mum and dad. In this case, leadership was literally earned through transmitting genes, not straight up aggression or fighting. In fact, disagreements were usually settled through posture, vocalizations, and deference, not bloodshed. And even more incredible still, wolf pups would tend to be incredibly cooperative, with older siblings often helping to feed, babysit, and protect the younger siblings. In essence, wolf packs are no different from Amish families, except there's a lot more howling and inappropriate licking involved. Getting back on track, in 1999, Dave Mech published these findings in a pivotal paper entitled Alpha Status, Dominance, and Division of Labor in Wolf Packs, in which he openly acknowledged that the alpha model was misleading, stating, "I conclude that the typical wolf pack is a family, with the adult parents guiding the activities of the group, and young members constitute a temporary portion of most packs, and the only long-term members are the breeding pair." Mech even recommended that we move away from terms like alpha male and alpha female, and instead use more accurate ones, like breeding male and breeding female. Finally, Mech even tried to get his publisher to stop printing his 1970 book, or at least slap a disclaimer on it. That's how seriously he took the correction. So, to put it briefly, wild wolves are not rank obsessed. Their lives revolve around kinship, cooperation, and ultimately, family. Much like humans, packs stay together for years, until adolescent wolves mature and eventually disperse to find mates and territories, creating packs of their own. Full disclosure, there are instances where packs will allow other unrelated wolves to join, but these members remain non-reproductive, and tend to just add to a pre-existing family unit, so this doesn't really detract from the family model. Now, there is one last thing I should mention. Although all wolves have the same potential to be leaders, or as we've established, to be parents, there is one strange trait that on paper does make a braver, bolder leader. And what, pray tell, is this magical trait that makes for a braver, bolder leader? A brain parasite. Yeah, it's a brain parasite. Yep. Specifically, protozoan called Toxoplasma gondii, a microscopic parasite best known for its bizarre ability to manipulate its host's behavior. But how does this parasite actually work? Well, once T. gondii enters the body, usually via ingestion, it travels from the gut to the brain and forms cysts, long-term growths that will affect hormone and fear regulation. It affects these processes via an increase in dopamine and testosterone production, which are directly linked to heightened aggression, impulsivity, and risk-taking behavior. The most illustrative example of this parasite in action is between rodents and cats. When a rodent becomes infected with Toxoplasma gondii, something unusual starts to happen. If it encounters cat urine, or any scent that it would normally associate with a predator, it no longer reacts with fear. The typical avoidance response just disappears. As a result, the rodent keeps moving around as if nothing's wrong, ignoring the very warning signals that would usually keep it alive. This newfound fearlessness leads it into cat-populated areas, and unsurprisingly, often straight into the path of a cat, which, for a rodent, tends to be the end of the line. But for T. gondii, that's not a dead end, it's the goal. The parasite's entire strategy is built around getting into a cat, more specifically, into the cat's intestines, where it can finally reproduce. Because T. gondii is host-specific, only felines can serve as its final destination. Any other animal it infects, well, they're just collateral, a stepping stone. Which does beg the question, if that's how it affects rodents, then how does it affect other animals that are not prey to house cats? Well, in humans, it's estimated that around 25% of the global population is infected with T. gondii. Some studies have even linked the infection to increased impulsivity, greater risk-taking, and even a higher likelihood of entrepreneurship. Less charmingly, though not entirely surprisingly, infected individuals have also been found to be statistically more prone to car accidents. Now, getting back to wolves, a 2022 study published in Communications Biology revealed something remarkable. Wolves infected with T. gondii were over 11 times more likely to leave their birth pack early, and 46 times more likely to become pack leaders than non-infected individuals. Leaving their natal pack early naturally gives them a head start in establishing themselves. But their success isn't just about timing, it's also about temperament. The study found that infected wolves were far bolder, more willing to explore unfamiliar territory, and more likely to confront rivals to claim land. Those last two are particularly risky moves, but they're also the ones that create opportunity for leadership. Since forming a pack requires both a territory and a mate, this heightened boldness effectively increases their chances of starting a new pack sooner. However, this newfound fearlessness does come at a cost. The same study found that infected wolves were also more prone to risky behaviors that increased their mortality. The infected wolves showed less caution around humans and other predators, and in areas where wolves overlap with mountain lions, infected individuals were killed by cougars more often than their uninfected counterparts. So while T. gondii infection may make wolves bolder and more likely to lead, it also means that they're more likely to die trying. So there you have it. The alpha myth, its origins, its propagation, and Dave Meach, the man who to this day still tries to correct his mistake. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.